On the morning of June 4, 1942, at 10:24 a.m., something extraordinary unfolded in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, about 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky peered down from his altitude of 14,000 feet and witnessed what seemed utterly impossible. Below him, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers moved through the water in a flawless diamond formation. The decks of these massive warships teemed with aircraft in various states of preparation. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden flight decks. Ordnance carts sat positioned next to bombers standing ready. Every single plane was undergoing final preparations for takeoff. The carriers had never been in a more exposed position, completely defenseless against attack from above. This moment should never have occurred. McClusky had spent the previous 2 hours scanning the ocean horizon, finding nothing but empty water. His fuel reserves were plummeting toward critical levels. Behind him came 32 dive bombers, all following him toward what appeared to be certain disaster. The Japanese fleet sat nowhere near where military intelligence had predicted they would be. His own squadrons, split between the Enterprise and Hornet, had become scattered and fragmented. Things had gone terribly wrong from the start. The torpedo squadron from one carrier had already been decimated. 8 planes had flown into the battle, and all 8 had been obliterated. Only one pilot had survived to tell what happened. The entire American assault operation was unraveling. Yet McClusky had made a crucial decision 30 minutes earlier that would reshape the entire war in the Pacific. When he arrived at the coordinates where he should have encountered the Japanese fleet and discovered only endless ocean, he refused to turn back toward his own ship. Instead, his eyes caught sight of a lone Japanese destroyer racing through the water at maximum speed, heading northeast. This was the destroyer Arashi, which had been dropping depth charges on an American submarine and was now rushing to rejoin its fleet. In that instant, McClusky made a leap of intuition that would change everything. He chose to follow the destroyer's wake through the water. As he now pushed forward into his dive, McClusky prepared to deliver a strike that would shatter Japanese naval dominance in merely 5 minutes of devastating assault. The Japanese below had absolutely no warning that American dive bombers hung directly overhead. They possessed no radar system to alert them. Their fighter protection, the Zero fighters that had just annihilated American torpedo bombers, remained at sea level, miles away. The airspace above their carriers lay completely open and undefended. These next 5 minutes would eventually be characterized by Admiral Chester Nimitz as the pivotal moment that determined the fate of the entire Pacific campaign and everything at Midway. At precisely 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Commander McClusky rolled his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, and 31 additional dive bombers followed him downward. Japanese lookouts on the carriers screamed warnings, but they came far too late. To comprehend the significance of these 5 minutes, one must first understand Japan's perception of itself and its accomplishments over the previous 6 months since Pearl Harbor struck. In early 1942, the Japanese Empire viewed itself as invincible, and the evidence appeared to support this assessment. Since December 7, 1941, Japanese military forces had conquered territories exceeding the size of Europe. Hong Kong had fallen in just 18 days. Manila had surrendered after 26 days. Singapore, that fortress of British power, had capitulated in 70 days. The Japanese had expelled the British from Malaya, driven the Dutch from Indonesia, and forced the Americans from the Philippines. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier striking force, had never suffered defeat. It had destroyed 5 battleships during the assault on Pearl Harbor. It had struck Darwin in Australia. It had forced the British Eastern Fleet to abandon the Indian Ocean, sinking the carrier Hermes along with 2 cruisers. Wherever Japan's carriers ventured, they brought devastation. The pilots commanding these aircraft stood as the most battle-tested aviators on Earth, having seen continuous combat in China since 1937. The Mitsubishi Zero fighter proved superior to every Allied fighter in the Pacific theater. The Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers had demonstrated overwhelming effectiveness against every target they faced. Japanese naval thinking centered on the doctrine of attack, on the supremacy of the offensive, on the certainty of victory achieved through superior discipline and warrior spirit. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Yamato, was believed capable of overcoming any material disadvantage. Japanese officers harbored the conviction that their fighting men simply surpassed American soldiers. Better prepared, more seasoned, more devoted, prepared to give their lives for the emperor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the combined fleet, had conceived the Midway operation to complete what Pearl Harbor had begun. The strategy possessed elegant ambition. A feint attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces northward. Meanwhile, the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled would strike Midway and draw American carriers into a decisive engagement. The Japanese would obliterate them through sheer overwhelming numerical superiority. The numbers seemed insurmountable. Yamamoto had assembled more than 200 vessels for the Midway operation. 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, 46 destroyers, and 15 submarines comprised the force. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu transported 248 aircraft piloted by the world's most accomplished naval aviators. The battleship Yamato, flying Yamamoto's flag as commander of the combined fleet, displaced 72,000 tons and mounted 9 18-inch guns, the most powerful naval cannons ever constructed. Standing against this armada, the Americans possessed 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The carrier Yorktown had suffered damage during the Coral Sea engagement and required 3 months of repairs according to standard estimates. However, Pearl Harbor Navy Yard workers had restored her in just 3 days, adequate for at least one more engagement. The American force found itself outnumbered in virtually every category except one critical advantage. They possessed foreknowledge of Japanese movements. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had successfully broken the Japanese naval code. They had identified Midway as the objective. They knew the operation would commence on June 4th. They understood the composition of the Japanese force and their planned approach. Admiral Nimitz had positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, concealed and prepared. Yet prior knowledge provided no guarantee of success. The American attacks executed on the morning of June 4th had proven catastrophic. Marine fighter aircraft from Midway itself had been slaughtered by 0 fighters. Army B-17 bombers attacking from altitude scored no direct hits. Marine dive bomber pilots who pressed home their assaults were shot down at a 5-to-1 ratio. Torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers attacked in separate waves without fighter protection and without coordinated timing. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet sent 15 aircraft into the fight. All 15 were destroyed. Ensign George Gay alone survived, floating in the Pacific while observing the battle continuing around him. Of the 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers, only 6 returned to their home ships, and not a single torpedo found its mark. The attack seemed both futile and murderous. Japanese Zero fighters dove from altitude, their 20mm cannons tearing through the slow and vulnerable TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Anti-aircraft bursts filled the sky with smoke. American torpedoes, handicapped by mechanical defects, either ran beneath their targets or simply failed to detonate. On the bridge of the carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida observed the American assault waves with a mixture of scorn and professional respect. Fuchida had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack. He had directed the air group that destroyed Battleship Row. Few men alive possessed his understanding of carrier warfare. He recognized the courage displayed by American torpedo bomber crews, yet their attacks had accomplished nothing. Not a single carrier had taken damage. The Americans, Fuchida believed, were squandering their aircraft and personnel for 0 result. What escaped Fuchida's awareness was that those apparently suicidal torpedo attacks had achieved something profoundly significant. They had pulled the Japanese fighter patrol down toward sea level. Dozens of Zero fighters swarmed low across the water, methodically destroying the remaining American torpedo bombers. Every Japanese fighter had descended to the lower altitude. Their pilots maintained laser focus on the immediate threat directly in front of them. No defenders remained watching the sky overhead. At 10:20 a.m. on the Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo issued the command to launch the counterstrike against the American carrier force. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had finally located the American fleet. Nagumo resolved to annihilate them. On Akagi's flight deck, 36 aircraft occupied launch position. Engines were running. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers stood armed and fueled, ready to devastate American carriers. On Kaga, 30 planes waited. On Soryu, another 21 sat prepared. The Japanese counterstrike totaled 87 aircraft, sufficient to sink all 3 American carriers. Admiral Nagumo exuded confidence. His carriers had just successfully repelled massive strikes. His pilots had shot down scores of American planes. Now retribution would arrive. The large carriers began turning into the wind. Within minutes, the launch sequence would commence. Destruction of the American carrier force would begin. Then the dive bombers appeared. Lieutenant Commander McClusky's radio transmission carried a single word: attack. He rolled into his dive at precisely 10:24 a.m. 31 additional Dauntless dive bombers pushed over behind him. They descended from 14,000 feet at 260 miles per hour, their engines screaming as they plunged downward at 70-degree angles. The Japanese possessed no time for reaction. Anti-aircraft guns that had been so effective against the low-flying torpedo bombers could not traverse and elevate with sufficient speed to track dive bombers descending from altitude. The Zero fighters remained miles distant and thousands of feet too low. The Japanese carriers, having just turned into the wind for launching operations, could not execute evasive maneuvers. They presented perfect targets. At 2,500 feet, the pilots released their bombs. The 500-pound armor-piercing bombs, equipped with delayed fuses, punched through the flight deck before detonating deep within the ship. 4 seconds of fall time elapsed before impact. Those 4 seconds altered the trajectory of the entire war. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:25 a.m. It penetrated just behind the island superstructure. The explosion detonated aviation fuel and armed ordnance scattered across the flight deck. A second bomb hit near the forward elevator. A third impacted the port side. A fourth struck the bridge area, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and nearly all senior officers present. Within 60 seconds, Kaga transformed from a powerful warship into an inferno. At the same moment, 3 bombers from Lieutenant Richard Best's division attacked Akagi. The formation had become disorganized, and nearly all dive bombers had targeted Kaga instead. Best extracted his 2 wingmen from their dives and veered toward the second carrier. His bomb struck Akagi directly amidships, penetrated the flight deck, and detonated in the hangar deck below. The blast detonated stored torpedoes and bombs. Secondary explosions propagated throughout the vessel. Commander Fuchida, standing on Kaga's bridge, heard the shriek of dive bombers seconds before impact. He glanced upward to see 3 dark aircraft plummeting toward his position. A terrible silence gripped the ship for 1 instant. Then the first bomb connected, and the explosion lifted him from his feet. Smoke and flame erupted from below. He watched helplessly as Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu simultaneously burst into flames. 3 carriers burning at the same instant. A scene, by his account, too horrible to witness. The 4th carrier, Soryu, faced attack by dive bombers from Yorktown. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie coordinated 17 planes in a flawless assault. 3 bombs struck Soryu in rapid succession. The first detonated near the forward elevator. The second exploded amidships. The third struck aft. Aviation fuel caught fire. Bombs and torpedoes detonated. Soryu quickly became a raging inferno. The crew began abandoning ship. The assault concluded after 5 minutes. When silence returned, 3 Japanese fleet carriers lay mortally wounded. Akagi, the flagship of the carrier striking force, burned beyond control. Kaga, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major Japanese operation since, was consumed by explosions. Soryu, the smallest of the fleet carriers, was engulfed completely in flames. More than 240 aircraft perished, either burned on flight decks or trapped in hangars below. Over 700 highly trained pilots and aircrew were dead or dying in the fires. The tally of losses proved staggering. These 3 carriers represented 2/3 of Japan's entire fleet carrier strength. Each had participated in every major Japanese naval operation since Pearl Harbor. Kaga displaced 36,000 tons and carried 91 aircraft. Akagi displaced 38,000 tons and carried 90 aircraft. Soryu displaced 18,000 tons and carried 71 aircraft. Together, they formed the foundation of Japanese naval air power. The pilots and crew lost in those 5 minutes represented an irreplaceable loss. Japan had invested years training these men. Their combat experience extended back to the China campaign, beginning in 1937. Torpedo bomber pilots could place their weapons within feet of targets. Dive bomber pilots could strike moving ships from 12,000 feet altitude. Fighter pilots had destroyed Allied aircraft over China, at Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, across the Dutch East Indies, and beyond. This burning wreckage represented far more than mere equipment consumed in fire. The expertise accumulated over years, the irreplaceable skills built through countless operations, all of it vanished in an instant as flames consumed everything. The timing of the American assault made the catastrophe exponentially worse. Had the bombers arrived just 10 minutes sooner, numerous Japanese aircraft would have remained secured inside the protective hangar decks below. If the strike had come 10 minutes later, most planes would have already launched into the sky, leaving the flight decks relatively empty and safer. Instead, the American dive bombers struck at the absolute worst moment imaginable. Every single carrier presented a packed flight deck crammed with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft ready for launch. The flight decks had transformed into floating ammunition dumps. At Akagi, Admiral Nagumo staggered from the explosion's force, trying desperately to hold his command together from the carrier's bridge. But the fires continued their relentless spread. Thick smoke engulfed the bridge. By 10:46 a.m., Nagumo made his decision. He couldn't stay. Down a rope he climbed, his body straining against the flames below. His staff descended after him. They made it to the light cruiser Nagara. From that vantage point, Nagumo watched helplessly as his entire striking force burned before his eyes. Back aboard the carriers, emergency crews fought with desperate intensity. Captain Taigiro Aoki refused to abandon his post on the bridge, determined to save his ship from the spreading inferno. The fires proved unstoppable. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the vessel as aviation fuel and ammunition detonated in sequence. Below decks, the hangar became a raging hellscape. Sailors trapped in the lower compartments faced impossible choices as smoke and flames consumed everything. Some perished in the intense heat. Others chose the sea. The air officer turned to Fuchida and spoke grimly about abandoning the bridge soon. Fuchida, already weakened from an appendectomy performed just before battle, could only witness the slow death of the very carrier that had delivered the strike to Pearl Harbor. On Akagi, 267 men went down with the ship. Kaga suffered a similar fate. The multiple direct bomb hits had sparked uncontrollable fires that raged throughout her hull. Her damage control systems had been engineered to handle single impacts, not the catastrophic simultaneous explosions now occurring. The ship's water mains burst open, electrical power vanished, communication between decks disappeared completely. Inside Kaga, firefighting crews found themselves paralyzed. No water to fight the flames, no power to operate the equipment, no way to coordinate. The vessel's list grew worse as seawater poured into the lower compartments. By afternoon, the command came. Abandon ship. Kaga went down with 811 men. Soryu met an even quicker end. Captain Ryosaku Yanaji Motoi stood firm, refusing to leave. His executive officer pleaded with him. Others begged. He would not go. He would remain with his ship. Soryu's hull, thinner than the larger carriers, offered less resistance to the consuming flames. Fire burned through the bulkheads with terrible speed. The vessel developed a dangerous tilt that only increased. At 7:13 p.m. on June 4th, Soryu rolled over and slipped beneath the surface, taking Captain Yanaji Motoi and 711 crew members into the deep. Yet one Japanese carrier had survived the assault. Hiryu had been positioned several miles north of the other three, far enough to escape the initial devastation. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi commanded Hiryu, and he acted immediately. At 10:50 a.m., while the three other carriers burned, Hiryu launched her counterstrike, 18 dive bombers protected by 6 Zero fighters. At 1:30 p.m., these aircraft discovered Yorktown and pressed home their attack. 3 bombs found their mark, igniting fires and destroying her boiler systems. Hiryu prepared a second assault at 2:30 p.m. 8 more torpedo bombers escorted by Zeros located Yorktown at 2:45 p.m. and scored 2 devastating hits. The damage was severe. Yorktown developed a terrible list. At 3:00 p.m., Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order. Get off the ship. The carrier that had been miraculously repaired in just 72 hours, that had contributed dive bombers to the strike destroying 3 Japanese carriers, now sat crippled and defenseless. Yet American response came swiftly. Scout planes from Yorktown spotted Hiryu. At 5 p.m., Enterprise's dive bombers roared into attack. 24 dauntless bombers screamed down on the last remaining Japanese carrier. 4 bombs struck home, 2 exploded near the forward elevator, 2 detonated amidships. Fires erupted and spread with frightening speed. Aviation fuel caught fire. The hangar deck became a sheet of flames. By 6:30 p.m., Hiryu burned beyond control. Her flight deck twisted into a nightmarish tangle of burning metal. Admiral Yamaguchi chose not to leave his flagship. He and Captain Tomoe Kaku remained aboard the blazing carrier, embracing death rather than the shame of survival after defeat. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu was scuttled by Japanese destroyer torpedoes. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down together. Another 392 officers and men perished. The scale of Japan's defeat staggered comprehension. In a single day of battle, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, all 4 veterans of Pearl Harbor. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Gone. Japan lost 248 aircraft and roughly 3,000 men, including many of the Imperial Navy's most experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft specialists. The striking force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months ceased to exist. The blow struck deep into Japanese consciousness. Japanese officers had convinced themselves that their superior training, accumulated experience, and warrior spirit made them unbeatable. They had conquered half the Pacific in 6 months. They had never lost a major fleet engagement. Then, in a single morning, American pilots flying from carriers fewer in number destroyed the heart of Japan's carrier force. Commander Fuchida, nursing broken ankles aboard the destroyer that pulled him from Akagi's wreckage, grasped the terrible truth instantly. Japan had not just lost a battle, Japan had lost the war. The naval air advantage that enabled Japanese conquest had evaporated. The irreplaceable veteran pilots lay dead. The carriers requiring years of construction now rested at the ocean bottom. Japan could never recover from this single day. American losses presented a stark contrast. 1 carrier lost, Yorktown, which arrived in the battle already damaged and arguably should never have been there. The destroyer Hammond went down during salvage operations on Yorktown, sunk by a Japanese submarine. American aircraft losses totaled 147 planes. Personnel losses came to 307 men. The exchange was catastrophic for Japan. 4 carriers versus 1. 248 aircraft versus 147. Approximately 3,000 men against 307. Industrial capacity made all the difference. America could replace what it lost. Japan could not. Yorktown represented just one of 7 American carriers. 2 additional carriers, Essex and Independence, would commission before year's end in 1942. By the end of 1943, America would commission 13 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers. By war's end, the American Navy operated over 100 carriers of all types, fleet carriers, light carriers, and escort carriers. Japan lacked the capacity. Japanese shipyards might produce 1 carrier yearly under perfect circumstances. The industrial foundation was insufficient. Resources ran short. Skilled workers were inadequate. Japan began the war with 6 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. After Midway, 4 fleet carriers were gone. Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged at Coral Sea, needed months for repairs. Japan's carrier force lay crippled. Pilot losses proved even more devastating. Japanese naval aviation training required years to produce combat-ready pilots. The selection criteria remained extremely rigorous. The rejection rate was harsh. Japan possessed perhaps 1,500 thoroughly trained carrier pilots at war's start. After Midway, maybe 1,000 remained. The training system couldn't generate replacements fast enough. By 1944, Japanese carrier squadrons would field minimally trained pilots in obsolete machines, facing American pilots possessing hundreds of training hours in cutting-edge aircraft. Admiral Yamamoto commanded from the distant battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles from the action. The news of catastrophe reached him with shock. He had assembled over 100 ships for the Midway operation, the most powerful fleet Japan had ever committed to battle. He had planned to obliterate the American carriers. Instead, the American Navy had destroyed his own carrier force. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued orders. Abort the Midway operation. Withdraw immediately. The invasion fleet turned toward home. The retreat humiliated everyone. The landing force designated to occupy Midway never approached. The battleships meant to bombard the atoll never fired. The submarines positioned to intercept American carriers were nowhere near the action. The diversionary assault on the Aleutians accomplished only the occupation of 2 barren islands Japan would abandon within a year. American forces pursued the fleeing Japanese fleet. On June 6th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet caught the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma. Both vessels had collided during the chaotic nighttime withdrawal. Mikuma, slowed to 12 knots, became an easy target. American dive bombers attacked repeatedly. 5 bombs struck Mikuma. She went down that afternoon. Mogami suffered severe damage but managed to limp away for repairs lasting a full year. The Battle of Midway concluded. The strategic consequences were immediate and permanent. Japan relinquished the strategic initiative. The expansionist phase ended. From June 4, 1942 forward, Japan would fight defensively. Americans would dictate where and when battles occurred. Japanese commanders would respond constantly, always with inadequate forces, always struggling to concentrate remaining carrier air strength. 8 weeks after Midway, American forces invaded Guadalcanal. This campaign would consume 6 months and bleed Japanese air power continuously. Carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku participated in the Guadalcanal battles. Both survived, but their air groups were devastated. When the Guadalcanal campaign concluded, Japan had lost hundreds more pilots and machines. The training pipeline fell further behind. By mid-1943, Japanese carrier squadrons had become pale shadows of their former capability. The deterioration accelerated. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American fleet, a day Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot from the sky in a single day. The pilots flying these missions possessed minimal training and negligible combat experience. They flew toward concentrated anti-aircraft fire and encountered American fighters controlled by radar. The destruction was absolute. By October 1944, when Japanese carriers made their final combat appearance at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the carriers had become empty shells. They carried few aircraft and had no skilled pilots to operate them. Japanese commanders deployed carriers as sacrificial decoys, sailing northward to attract American attention while battleships attempted the invasion beaches. The deception succeeded initially. Admiral William Halsey took the bait and chased the carriers northward, but American escort carriers and destroyers repelled the Japanese battleships. The Japanese decoy carriers were sunk by American air attacks. It proved meaningless. They carried no aircraft anyway. The path from Midway to complete Japanese defeat stretched clear and inevitable. Without carrier air superiority, Japan couldn't defend conquered territories. Without territories, Japan couldn't obtain the resources, especially oil, fueling the war machine. Without resources, industrial production collapsed. Without the ability to mass-produce replacements, the military machine ground to a halt. Once this downward spiral began, there was no way to reverse it. Lieutenant Commander McClusky's choice to push forward with his fuel running critically low, to shadow the destroyer Arashi through the open water, this single decision set everything in motion. The moment arrived when the Japanese carriers sat exposed and defenseless. To strike at that precise instant of vulnerability changed everything. Admiral Nimitz would later declare that McClusky's judgment alone determined whether the carrier task force and Midway's defenders would survive. Without his decision, without those 5 minutes of destruction unfolding at 10:24 a.m. on June 4th, the entire Pacific conflict might have dragged on for years beyond 1945. The Japanese officers who endured Midway felt the weight of what they'd lost. Captain Fuchida would eventually record his thoughts. The battle sealed Japan's fate. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who led the carrier striking force, found himself stripped of command and exiled to a remote posting. In July 1944, as the battle for Saipan raged, rather than accept capture, he took his own life. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, who perished alongside the Hiryu, had been regarded as one of the finest naval officers in the entire Imperial fleet. His death robbed Japan of precisely the kind of leader who might have salvaged something from the avalanche of defeats to come. For the American pilots, though, the triumph carried a bitter edge. Torpedo Squadron 8 faced total annihilation. Only one survivor, Ensign George Gay, emerged from 15 crews. Torpedo Squadron 6 off the Enterprise lost 10 of its 14 planes. The Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 suffered even worse, losing 10 of 12. The dive bomber crews paid their price as well. Of 115 American aircraft that descended on those Japanese carriers that day, 54 never returned. The price of victory cut deep, yet those who flew home understood they'd achieved something remarkable. McClusky himself caught anti-aircraft fire in his shoulder during his desperate escape. He limped back toward the Enterprise with barely 5 gallons of fuel remaining in his tanks. Other pilots weren't as fortunate. Some ran completely dry and ditched into the dark ocean below. 10 men from McClusky's formation vanished into the water and were never recovered. Still, the survivors grasped the magnitude of their accomplishment. They'd obliterated Japan's carrier striking force. They'd reversed the tide sweeping through the Pacific. That 5-minute window, when circumstances aligned perfectly, carried both fortune and purpose. Fortune that McClusky spotted the Arashi at all. Fortune that the Japanese carriers were turning into the wind precisely when they needed to launch aircraft, precisely the wrong moment for them. Fortune that their fighter cover had dropped low, chasing torpedo bombers instead of remaining overhead. Yet fortune could only flourish where courage prepared the ground. McClusky's decision to extend his search when fuel gauges pointed toward empty. The torpedo crews who threw away their lives drawing Japanese fighters downward. The cryptographers who penetrated Japanese codes. Admiral Nimitz positioning his carriers northeast of Midway, based on intelligence purchased with that code-breaking advantage. All of it mattered. War correspondent Robert Sherrod would later write that no battle in the Pacific War proved more pivotal. Not Guadalcanal, which would come months later. Not the grinding assaults on Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Midway answered the fundamental question, who would possess the Pacific? From June 4th onward, that answer was clear. America would command these waters. Japan would fight defensively, surrendering territory island by island, battle by battle, until atomic fire fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, ending everything. Those 5 minutes echoed across 3 years. By July 1945, as Japan braced for invasion of the home islands, military strategists believed they might possibly repel a single landing attempt. But absent carrier air power, without naval dominance, lacking resources to sustain any prolonged defense, defeat remained certain. The kamikaze attacks of that final year, pilots crashing planes deliberately into American vessels, represented Japan's utter collapse of naval aviation capacity. The experienced aviators had fallen at Midway and in subsequent battles. The replacements, barely trained and desperate, possessed only one option: smash their aircraft into enemy ships. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, never recovered from the blow. Though he retained command of the combined fleet, his health deteriorated steadily. Fatalism took hold. In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted intelligence about his inspection tour of forward positions. Admiral Nimitz authorized an assassination operation. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 fighters found Yamamoto's transport plane over Bougainville and shot it down. The man who orchestrated both Pearl Harbor and Midway was gone. His assassination followed directly from American code-breaking, the same advantage that had delivered victory at Midway. Those 5 minutes, starting at 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, revealed something fundamental about modern warfare. Industrial production trumps fighting resolve. Intelligence trumps operational planning. The power to replace losses faster than they occur decides wars. The capacity to read enemy intentions decides wars. The ability to coordinate multiple forces, even when circumstances deteriorate, decides wars. Japan entered this conflict convinced that superior training, superior spirit, and operational brilliance would overcome America's industrial edge. Midway shattered that assumption. American aviators, many fresh from training, piloting obsolete TBD torpedo bombers, died attacking Japanese carriers. Their sacrifice accomplished nothing in isolation. Yet they performed their function perfectly. They dragged Japanese fighters to sea level. They created the opening the dive bombers needed. The system functioned even when individual pieces failed catastrophically. Japan's system, despite its excellence in pilot preparation and fighting quality, could not adapt. When the carriers took bomb hits, when fires erupted, when admirals had to abandon their flagships, the entire command structure collapsed. No redundancy existed, no depth remained to absorb losses. The carriers themselves proved vulnerable despite their offensive power. Aviation fuel lines ran exposed across hangar decks. Ordnance sat stored without adequate protection. Damage control capabilities fell short. These ships could dish out devastating punishment, but they couldn't absorb punishment themselves. The same pattern extended to strategic thinking. Yamamoto's Midway plan involved intricate coordination, multiple forces arriving in sequence, deceptions designed to confuse American commanders. Complexity bred vulnerability. When American code-breaking revealed these plans, the complexity worked against Japan. Forces became scattered. Battleships steamed too far from the carriers. The invasion fleet couldn't reinforce the carriers. The diversionary attack pulled away resources that might have tipped the balance. American strategy embraced simplicity. Nimitz placed his carriers northeast of Midway. He waited. When Japanese aircraft came, he counterattacked with everything available. The assaults arrived disorganized, squadrons staggered and uncoordinated. Yet enough of them connected to destroy the Japanese carriers. Simple planning executed imperfectly proved more effective than complex planning requiring perfect execution. Midway's lessons transformed naval warfare for the remainder of the 20th century. Aircraft carriers would dominate the oceans. Battleships, regardless of armor or firepower, had become obsolete. A carrier launching airstrikes from hundreds of miles distant would control the seas. Nations that built replacement carriers faster than they sank them would win at sea. America constructed 115 carriers during the war. Japan built 25. That disparity decided the Pacific conflict. The young officers leading dive bomber formations on June 4, 1942, couldn't comprehend they were reshaping history. Their minds focused on the immediate, hitting targets, surviving anti-aircraft barrages, reaching their carriers alive. McClusky, shoulder bleeding, and his plane riddled with bullet holes, worried whether his fuel reserves would carry him back to the Enterprise. Lieutenant Richard Best, pulling from his dive to attack a different target, concentrated on evading pursuing Japanese fighters. Commander Max Leslie, heading the Yorktown's dive bombers against the Soryu, grieved the aircraft he'd lost. Yet historians would recognize that these men, through 5 minutes of combat, accomplished what military forces fighting for years could not achieve. They crippled Japanese naval power. They shifted momentum across the entire Pacific War. They created the foundation for eventual Allied victory. Admiral Nimitz would write that without Midway's victory, the war might have continued 3 additional years. 3 more years of fighting. 3 more years of casualties. 3 more years of destruction. The Japanese aviators who perished in flames aboard the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were extraordinarily skilled and devoted warriors. Years of training shaped them, combat experience few possessed defined them. They'd executed flawless assaults on Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and elsewhere. Yet on June 4, 1942, caught aboard their carriers while recovering aircraft, unable to launch, unable to mount effective defense, unable to escape, their abilities couldn't save them from bombs arriving at precisely the wrong moment. Commander Fuchida, who survived despite broken ankles, spent the remainder of the war as a staff officer. He would compose the authoritative Japanese account of the battle, released in 1955 as Midway, the Battle That Doomed Japan. In these pages, Fuchida acknowledged American code-breaking had achieved complete surprise. The Japanese carriers had been caught at their most exposed moment. The battle had sealed Japan's fate. He credited American intelligence work, American pilots who persisted despite catastrophic losses, American commanders who positioned forces with precision. The 5 minutes that destroyed Japan's hopes commenced at 10:24 a.m. and concluded at 10:29 a.m. During those 300 seconds, 3 aircraft carriers received mortal wounds. Over the following hours, all 3 would sink beneath the waves. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor lay destroyed. The force that dominated these waters for 6 months was obliterated. McClusky returned to the Enterprise with 52 bullet perforations in his fuselage, a wound in his shoulder, and almost no fuel remaining. He had made the most consequential tactical judgment of the Pacific War. His choice to extend the search, to follow that destroyer's wake, to seize the moment when opportunity appeared, altered the course of history. The Navy Cross would be his reward, though he never accepted the label of hero. He insisted he had simply performed his duty. That humility reflected the American temperament regarding Midway. Survivors didn't celebrate their achievement. They mourned absent comrades. They prepared for subsequent battles, understanding that Midway represented one victory in an extended struggle. Yet it was the victory that made all others possible. Those 5 minutes revealed a core principle of modern warfare. Wars aren't decided by individual battles, but by compounding advantages. Intelligence advantage, industrial advantage, training advantage, technological advantage. The side accumulating more advantages over time prevails. Japan possessed training superiority and tactical excellence. America possessed everything else. These 5 minutes made that disparity brutally obvious. From that morning forward, Japan fought defensively in a war it couldn't win. The empire that had conquered half of Asia and the Pacific within 6 months spent the next 3 years losing everything it had seized. American industrial might, seemingly infinite resources, replacement vessels, replacement aircraft, replacement pilots, ground down Japanese resistance until atomic bombs and surrender ended the conflict. The 5 minutes that destroyed Japan's chance for victory represented the most consequential 5 minutes of the Pacific War. This was the fulcrum upon which everything turned. Before 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japan retained some possibility, however remote, of negotiating acceptable peace terms. After 10:29 a.m., Japan had already lost. Everything following was simply history working out its predetermined conclusion. The bombs that fell on the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu in those 5 minutes decided not simply the battle, but the outcome of the entire Pacific War. This outcome didn't result from American superiority of courage or warrior spirit. The Japanese aviators who burned in those carrier compartments possessed courage matching any warriors in history. Rather, this outcome followed from intelligence, preparation, industrial capacity, and the accumulation of small advantages compounded over time. The code breakers reading Japanese transmissions. The shipyard workers repairing the Yorktown in 72 hours. The torpedo crews sacrificing themselves to pull fighters low. The destroyer steaming northeast at exactly the moment it would guide McClusky toward his target. Every element combined into 5 minutes that altered the world. When asked about his decision to continue searching when fuel was running out and the ocean seemed empty, McClusky replied he'd had no choice. His orders were clear: find and destroy the Japanese carriers. He'd found them. He'd destroyed them. That was his job. That his judgment at those critical moments when resources dwindled determined the fate of nations was simply the nature of warfare. Individual decisions sometimes matter more than anyone could foresee. 5 minutes sometimes matter more than 5 years. One pilot's choice to turn north instead of south can reshape history. Japanese carriers burned for hours before sinking. The fires, starting at 10:24 a.m., couldn't be contained. Aviation fuel ignited repeatedly. Bombs and torpedoes stored throughout the vessels kept detonating. Bulkheads fractured, decks warped upward, men trapped below drowned or burned. The ships that had seemed invulnerable in December 1941 had vanished by dawn on June 5, 1942. 5 minutes, 300 seconds. The span needed to brew coffee. The time required to cross a city block. The moment it takes to transform the world. At 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Japan still possessed a chance. At 10:29 a.m., that chance had burned away in the flames, consuming 3 aircraft carriers in the middle of the Pacific. Everything afterward was simply consequence.